Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes. We're just getting everyone into the webinar. So if you're seeing the title screen, that is what you should be seeing. If you're having any technical difficulty, please feel free to hit the raise hand button or put something in the chat and I will reach out to you and we will troubleshoot it. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. We're just letting all the attendees get into the webinar room and we'll get started in a few minutes. All right, it looks like everyone that was in the waiting room has joined. The numbers kind of stopped growing, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Accidental HR Person, Essential Practices for Managing Employees and Volunteers. This is our third session of the UP Nonprofit Conference Recalibrated. These free trainings are taking the place of our 2020 conference. And they feature learning opportunities like tonight, networking opportunities like our upcoming Mastermind, which I'll touch on in a few minutes, as well as sharing promising practices in those Mastermind sessions. So we're on human resources and volunteers tonight. Coming up in April, we'll have youth and community engagement on April 13th. May 11th will be operations and strategic planning. And June 8th will be fund development and financial management. So we hope you're able to check those out too. And our Mastermind follow-ups, these are held at 3 p.m. Eastern, the week following the webinar. So that'll be next Tuesday. And that is for members of Grow and Lead to get together on Zoom. It's not recorded and we take a deep dive into the topics for the month. So this month will be, again, HR and volunteer engagement. You do have to be a Grow and Lead member. If you're not, information is available on our website and will be included in the follow-up email that will go out tomorrow that will have the recording and more information on how to register for the Mastermind session. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that as well. Some Zoom features that we're using tonight. At the bottom, you will notice there is a Q&A box. If you type something into the Q&A box, it will be considered for our question and answer section at the end of tonight's webinar. We also have the chat box where you can connect with fellow participants and the raise hand feature. And again, if you're having any technical difficulties, you can hit that raise hand button and I will help you hopefully get it figured out. And with that, I am excited to introduce you to Karen Thompson and Linda Remsburg, our presenters for tonight. Welcome, ladies.
Thanks, Vic. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Thompson. I'm the Director of Operations at Grow and Lead, and I have worn the HR hat since 2000, and I'm a certified human resources professional with the Society for Human Resources Management.
Good evening. I'm Linda Remsburg, and I've been an associate at Grow and Lead since 2007. One of the areas I specialize in with nonprofits is volunteer engagement. Karen and I both have a lot of experience and training in these areas, but please keep in mind that we're not attorneys and we're not providing legal advice. So if you have a sticky situation regarding the law, you should consider consulting an attorney. Oops, excuse me. The webinar is being recorded tonight and will be sent to all participants.
We know that many smaller nonprofits have someone who may be their accidental HR person. It's usually someone who wasn't necessarily trained to perform HR functions, but they may have those duties assigned to them. If that's you, I see you, I am you. These are some of the hats that I wear, and I bet they look really similar to some of the hats you wear. We'd like to provide a few tips for how to manage this role. And the human resources is a term or human resources is a term that covers a broad range of topics, from recruitment through separation and everything in between. And the term reflects those who choose to work for your organization and the resources they bring. And your administration of the different components will really reflect your mission and your culture.
We couldn't possibly touch on all the facets of human resources in an hour, so we're going to focus on some of the basic strategies, tools, and practices that are most important when bringing personnel into your organization, whether they're paid employees or volunteers. Some of the things we'll talk about tonight apply to both, but there are some differences too. We hope that by the end of the session, you'll have a better understanding of the differences between classifications of personnel, including employees, contractors, and volunteers. And we hope you'll have learned some of the basics for recruiting volunteers and hiring paid staff, as well as retaining both of those types of personnel.
And we wanted to start off with talking about employees versus contractors. These are a few of the basic differences between an employee and a contractor. The key component of determining whether someone is considered an employee versus a contractor is the level of control that the employer has, both in what the contractor does and how they do it. Typically, contractors work for a short period of time and they have contracts with organizations. Your organization shouldn't be their sole source of income. Um, and some organizations think that they can hire a contractor instead of an employee to avoid paying taxes or unemployment. And we really encourage you to think about that, because doing so could result in your being in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And we're not going to be talking any further about contractors, but we wanted to share information on how they're different from employees.
The most commonly recognized difference between employees and volunteers is, of course, that volunteers aren't paid. And while that's a significant difference, it's not the only one. And the others are important too. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, workers are generally considered a volunteer if they, number one, serve without expecting or receiving compensation. Number two, they serve without pressure or coercion. Number three, they serve on a part-time basis. Four, their service doesn't displace regular employees. You can't eliminate a paid position and bring in volunteers to do the job. And number five, the service is not the type that would otherwise be performed by regular employees. Or in other words, you can't have employees and volunteers doing the same sorts of tasks. And number six, the worker serves in a nonprofit organization. They can't volunteer in a for-profit organization. That's illegal. So all of these criteria need to be in place in order to have a worker classified as a volunteer. If any one of them's not met, and this is very important to note, the individual could be classified as an employee, and as such would be subject to wages, overtime, et cetera, under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Before you start the hiring process or seeking volunteers, you need to have a very good idea of what you want them to do. And you need to be reasonably confident you're able to accommodate them. It's important to put the thought in up front before you post a position. When thinking of engaging potential volunteers or employees, I suggest starting by brainstorming a list of tasks you need to have done and involve others in your organization in doing that. And think about those services you'd like to provide if only you had more help. Perhaps there are tasks your paid staff regularly aren't able to get to that could be included in a volunteer position. Or maybe there are different time limited projects that volunteers could take on. Once you've brainstormed your list, start prioritizing. Consider your most critical needs and where additional help would have the biggest impact. Then take it a step further and determine what's realistic for your organization to take on. Ask yourself questions such as, is it a long-term or a short-term need to be filled? How much time would personnel need to devote to it? If it's a long-term need and more than a few hours a week, you may need to consider hiring an employee. Also consider what resources you need in place to bring someone on. Do you have the financial resources to pay an employee? Do you have the staff capacity to train and supervise a volunteer? Who would do that? The answers to these questions will provide a basis for you to develop volunteer position descriptions or employee job descriptions. So first, volunteer position descriptions. Volunteer position descriptions or employee job descriptions basically outline the responsibilities, qualifications, and in short, what's expected of personnel. They're for the benefit of the personnel and the organization to make sure both sides are clear on expectations. And if you take away just one resource or tool from this webinar tonight, we hope it's the importance of a well thought out position description or an employee job description. They're documents that will be referred to time and again by the personnel and their supervisors throughout their entire time with the organization. So let's start with a volunteer position description and just quickly walk through the parts that need to be included. First, all personnel deserve the respect that comes with a title. You'll want to give a brief overview of the purpose of the position, tell where the volunteer will be working, list the key responsibilities. This is the area that will probably include the most detail, the description. List any qualifications or special skills that are required or helpful for the position. And include what the benefits are for volunteers. And this is different than what we think of as benefits for employees, such as health insurance or paid vacation, et cetera. With volunteers, we're talking about intrinsic or internal benefits. For instance, an intrinsic benefit would be the joy of teaching a child a lifelong skill, or the camaraderie of serving with a group. And also extrinsic or external benefits, such as learning a marketable skill or gaining leadership experience. You'll also want to list the time commitment, training, and any other support provided by the organization. And finally, it needs to be very clear who the volunteer reports to, who their supervisor is, and who they go to if they have a concern or problem. And we'll email a volunteer position description sample and a template to you after the webinar.
Job descriptions for employees will include many of the items that Linda mentioned for volunteers, but there are a few differences. And I've listed the items that should be included. You'll want to try and be as realistic and specific as possible, especially in the essential function area. And in that area, you may choose to prioritize the items, or you might want to include the percentage of time spent in those areas. One thing I'd like to note is that whether a position is exempt or non-exempt is not determined by the job description. The Department of Labor has a 3-part test that will help you determine which way a position goes, and they have information on their website about that. And it's really kind of detailed, and we can't really go into it on the webinar. But feel free to contact me if you have trouble locating that information on their website. And I'll also include a sample employee job description following the webinar.
Once you have those well thought out written descriptions of the expectations of the position, and you're reasonably confident that you can provide the supervision and resources for personnel to be successful, you should be in a good position to start recruiting. And recruitment's a constant process of keeping your organization's name, your mission, and its volunteer or employment opportunities in front of people. In other words, it's marketing. The purpose of bringing personnel into your nonprofit, of course, is to further your mission. And people will want to work for an organization whose mission they see as worthwhile and valuable and that's making a difference. So keep your mission front and center. Use a variety of marketing strategies and vehicles, including things like newsletters, newspaper, TV, and radio stories, social media, and your website. Social media is probably the number one way of getting in front of the most people. Post regularly, like once a day, to the channels you're using, whether they be Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. Keep posts brief and upbeat. If you have a website, be sure to use your social media posts to drive people there to find more information. Your website is one of the most important tools you can use to build the visibility and credibility of your organization in general, and your volunteer and employment opportunities in particular. Make sure that when someone visits your homepage, they can very easily see where to find your volunteer and employment opportunities. Also, share success stories on your site. You want people to feel good about the impact of your organization and about potentially being part of it. Finally, the more clearly and consistently you can communicate who you are as an organization, the easier it will be to recruit.
And we would ask that you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your recruitment efforts. You should seek to remove bias against a candidate's personal characteristics that are unrelated to their job performance. And some examples of that would be their age, race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. And by removing bias, you'll prevent accidental discrimination in your process.
In addition to marketing as a recruitment strategy, it's also helpful to focus some recruiting efforts more specifically on populations that you suspect would be a good fit for your organization and the positions you need to fill. We've listed some of those groups to consider. In light of diversity, equity, and inclusion, drawing from a variety of groups is definitely a plus. There's real magic that can happen when people from different generations or backgrounds work together on a mission they're passionate about. And look for opportunities to meet and talk with these different populations directly and tailor your messages specifically to them. For volunteers especially, point out those internal and external benefits that they could tap into by volunteering with your organization. And don't underestimate the importance of those types of benefits to employees too. A final slide on recruiting. We're very fortunate in the UP to have two awesome online portals for recruiting and managing volunteers. They're sort of one-stop shops for volunteer needs. The way they work is that nonprofits can list their volunteer needs with the portals, and people wanting to volunteer can log on and see what opportunities are available and then connect with the nonprofit. United Way of the Eastern UP hosts a portal for nonprofits in Chippewa, Mackinac, and Luce counties, and United Way of Marquette County hosts the UPers United portal, which they're making available to nonprofits in any other county in the UP. And there's no cost to the nonprofits or the volunteers to use the services. So if you're looking for volunteers, I highly recommend you register on either of the portals. Um, Both United Ways host trainings periodically, and we'll be happy to talk to you about getting the most out of the sites.
So let's talk a little bit about application forms. This is a list of items that you should and shouldn't include on your application forms. Any information about age, race, national origin, disability, etc. Those things shouldn't be on your application forms, and it it prevents potential discrimination. On the right-hand side there on the bottom by criminal history, you'll see ban the box. If you're not familiar with ban the box legislation, it has to do with removing criminal history questions from employment applications to protect those convicted of a crime from being automatically disqualified. In the state of Michigan is a ban the box state, but only for public sector jobs. And we would just ask that you consider, banning the box on your own application forms.
For long-term or highly skilled volunteer positions, you'll want to use a volunteer application. And it's a lot like the employee application. You want to ask about a volunteer's interests, their skills, their availability. It should also include their contact information, things like prior volunteer experience. And depending on the position, you may want to ask for references. You can use one basic application for all of your volunteers, or it may make more sense for you to modify your application for different positions. For one-time volunteers, like for instance, an event that you might have, you may not need anything more than the basic contact information, or you may even just need information from the group leader. For instance, if it's a school or a church group that's volunteering with you. Depending on your organization, the number of volunteer positions, etc., an application can be posted online and or in person at your organization. These days, and even in non-COVID times, it's pretty common to have them available online for convenience sake. So if a volunteer's application looks good, it's important to follow up with an in-person interview as soon as possible. The less lag time you have between when a volunteer expresses interest and when you get them in the door to volunteer, the less likely you are to lose them somewhere along the way. An interview is an opportunity for you to learn more about a volunteer's skills and interests, and also to learn about their knowledge, motivations, which is very important, and expectations. And a topic I think is particularly helpful to bring up during an interview is how they like to be recognized for their efforts. Recognition of volunteers is very important and needs to be tailored to the individual. So it's nice to get some idea right up front what they would welcome and what would be a turnoff to them. For example, some people really like public recognition and others are stressed out by it. Some people like working with others and some prefer working alone. So ask them about their preferences. The interview is also an opportunity for the volunteer to find out about the organization. So include background information and be sure to give them the opportunity to ask questions too. It's a time to help them understand how their service will have an impact on the mission of the organization, or in other words, the difference that their service will be making in the world.
Employee interviews will likely be more formal than for volunteers, but the goal is still to find the best candidate for the position. First, you'll want to decide who will be involved in conducting the interviews and develop a plan that will outline everyone's role during the interview. I would recommend having more than one person, but having too many people can be intimidating. So, be mindful of that. Um, the questions you ask should help you judge the applicant's qualifications and skills. Use the same questions for all interviews to ensure you're consistent and that everyone's being treated fairly. Um, and remember, this is a stressful time for them, and they're interviewing you and your organization also. Um, and after you've selected your candidate, don't forget to notify everyone else, thanking them for their time and their effort in applying. And as the last step, to uh, ensure that you've collected all the interviewer notes and hold that as confidential information in your files. They shouldn't be, floating around the office for other people to read.
So let's say you've had an interview, it went well, and now you're interested in bringing the volunteer or employee aboard. Now's the time to do some background checking, including references if you've requested them. Depending on the position and what you found out in the interview, you may want to conduct a more thorough background check. Consider factors such as the client population, the level of supervision, and level of risk. Keep in mind that using arrest or conviction records is an absolute bar to employment or work as a volunteer disproportionately excludes certain racial groups. So such records should only be used if there's a compelling business reason for them. If the volunteer or employee is going to be working with a vulnerable population, such as children or the elderly, especially one-on-one, you'll want to do a criminal background check. And a commonly used check is iChat, which operates through the Michigan State Police. It's free for nonprofits. Um, if someone's going to be handling money or financial information, you might be well served by running a credit and or financial check. If they're going to be transporting people by motor vehicle, you might need a driving record check. And if something does show up in a background check, you shouldn't necessarily dismiss them, but definitely be aware and consider it when placing them in a position. You should discuss it with them directly. For instance, a drunk driving conviction when someone was 18 might show up on a background check, but now they're 28 and have successfully completed a sobriety court program and have been sober for 10 years. You wouldn't know that unless you asked them for an explanation. You may still not want them transporting clients, but it doesn't mean that they can't work in your organization in another capacity. Also keep in mind that you need to obtain written permission from any applicant to conduct a background check, and it should be separate from an application form.
Sometimes there just isn't going to be a good fit for an organization or an individual within your organization, and you need to let them know. And that's okay. The most important piece is to be respectful and let them know. And you don't have to go into a lot of detail, but you want to maintain a good relationship with, all applicants, because you never know when another position may become available and they would be a good fit for it. So just make sure everyone is notified and you keep your records for the standard retention period of 3 years. As the accidental HR person, your employee handbook is going to be your main reference tool. Um, it is going to help you ensure consistency for interpreting policy with employees and across time as well. I've listed some items that should be included in your handbook, but you'll really need to decide what's appropriate for your organization, and you'll need to know which laws impact you. A lot of the laws are dependent on how many employees you have. I do recommend that you have an attorney review your handbook before you distribute it to your employees. Yes, that's an investment, but that could prevent a potential lawsuit down the road.
Any organization that engages volunteers should have some form of a volunteer handbook. It's basically a collection of documents that help answer the questions: why should I volunteer here? How will I be volunteering here? And where do I fit into the organization? It's a good orientation tool for new volunteers, and it's also very valuable in maintaining clear expectations throughout a volunteer's entire time with your organization. It should include info about the organization and your mission, and also important policies and procedures. It doesn't have to be lengthy, it just needs to be clear. And it's best to keep it conversational and welcoming. Um, a welcome letter from the director of the organization is a helpful thing to include. You may also want to include a page at the end with a volunteer agreement. In the agreement, make it clear that their service is as a volunteer and there will be no compensation provided, and that they are volunteering of their own free will. You might want to add a line that states that they've read and understand the handbook and agree to abide by the policies and procedures included in it. And have them sign and date it, then give them a copy of the agreement and keep a copy on file. A best practice that helps keep the lines between employee service and volunteer service clear is to have separate employee and volunteer handbooks and try to keep any overlap between those to a minimum.
So here's a list of what you should and shouldn't include in personnel files. Generally, documents in the include side are related to the employees or volunteers' performance, their knowledge or skills that would be relevant for making employment decisions. The documents in the don't include column are more sensitive information, and that access to that information should really be limited to HR and executive leadership only. Supervisors don't need that information for making promotion, type decisions.
And with volunteers, you should have some method of tracking the number of hours they serve. And that can be tracked in a separate log, but you might want to include the monthly or annual total of their hours in their personnel file.
And here are some items to think about for retention. They really speak to the culture and sense of community that your organization has. The items we have listed don't necessarily cost a lot of money, but they do require you to pay attention. If people are leaving your organization, you really need to try to understand why. You can use exit interviews, but you also should try to talk with your current employees and volunteers. And understanding what people value will help you to discover what you can do to help improve retention.
I'd like to emphasize that with volunteers, recognizing their efforts is especially important to retention. Like a paycheck is an employee's reward, recognition is a volunteer's reward. So be generous and sincere in recognizing their efforts in both informal and formal ways. Informal recognition includes one-on-one sorts of everyday actions, such as saying thank you, taking a few minutes to chat about their day, their family, their pets, bringing in a treat they love, etc. Formal recognition is more public and such as like an annual recognition event or a shout out in your organization's newsletter or a social media post. But be sensitive to how comfortable they are with public recognition. If you don't know, ask them. And keep in mind that the key to any effective recognition is to make it personal, comfortable, and meaningful to the individual volunteer or employee for that matter.
We wanted to give you some resources. And the first one is the Upper Peninsula Human Resources Association. That's a local group for HR staff who typically wear more than one hat. HR isn't their only hat. They typically meet 4 times a year. It's relatively inexpensive. It's $60 to join. And one of those 4 meetings includes a legal update with attorneys. And they have a conference, a full day conference in the fall with lots of good learning sessions. They're relatively inactive right now with COVID, but check out their site, bookmark their site, and keep an eye out for them to becoming more active. Excuse me for just a second. And the next one, SHRM, is a national organization for human resources staff. They're really the gold standard. They're really big. They have a lot of professional development for HR staff. Their membership is, certainly more expensive. It's around $200 a year. But if you have a larger staff, or if you're an HR department of one, it's really worth that investment. They just have an enormous level of resources available, from webinars, newsletters, policy samples, lots of professional development, and help with keeping up with legislation. You can also subscribe to law firm newsletters. And of course, they're usually free. And during COVID, a lot of law firms produce webinars that would interpret legislation. They had webinars on PPP forgiveness, and they were really invaluable when things were coming down the pipe really fast.
And I'd like to mention a couple of excellent online resources for volunteer engagement. Ones I'd recommend are Volunteer Pro and Volunteer Hub. Both have a library of blogs on their websites that are free and include great content for working with volunteers at any level. Volunteer Pro has an excellent guide to managing volunteers you can download for free. They also post occasionally different documents and such that you might want to use with volunteers. Volunteer Hub has a newsletter you can subscribe to for free. Both companies also sell products and services for organizations with pretty well established and robust volunteer programs. Those products may or may not be right for your organization, but there's no obligation to buy. Their free content is definitely worth checking out. Well, we hope the information we presented tonight helps you feel more prepared and confident when you put on your HR hat. Before we move into questions, we want to remind you of the Member Mastermind session next Tuesday at 3 o'clock Eastern. It will be an opportunity to dig a little deeper into some of the areas we touched on tonight. but in a much more informal format and with a lot of opportunity for sharing and learning from one another. So, and we look forward to seeing you there. From here, we're ready to move into Q&A. If you haven't already, please type any questions you have into the Q&A box. Victoria, are there any questions that have come in yet?
Yes, our first one, I think will be more directed for Karen, because it is about revenue cuts and funding cuts. And so that question is, if funding is cut and you have to lay off an employee, can you move that position from a paid role to a volunteer role?
That's a really good question. I would think that you could. I'm going to ask for Linda's help on that too, and I may need to do some research on that. But if you have to end that position, if you can't have a paid person in that position, it does seem like you would be able to bring in a volunteer.
I would just add to take a to take a pretty good look at that criteria that we listed earlier in the webinar about what constitutes a volunteer. For instance, if the position is a full-time position, you're not going to want to bring in a volunteer. And if especially if it's a long-term position with a lot of hours, it's probably not a good idea to.
But they have to cut the position, I think, is the question. They've got, the budget cut, so they have to cut that position.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm thinking it might be a little different in that you could, then bring in a volunteer. So
that might be a question worth asking an attorney, just to be safe.
Awesome. Our next question is about application forms. And the question doesn't specify if this is a volunteer application or a employment application. So I'll have both of you answer. And it says, our background checks and applications are two forms, but are provided at the same time. Is that okay?
I think it's okay. It's good that they're separate forms. You have that separate permission. You've got it available if you need to do a background check or want to do a background check. The most important part is, does that position require a background check? You can't, just randomly do a background check because you want to. It needs to be tied to the function of the position.
Awesome. All right, our next question has to do, we're going back to classification of employee versus volunteer. And it has to do with all volunteer run organizations. This is an awesome question. It says, I recently talked with a peer who had the title of executive director, but learned that the organization has no paid staff. Is that acceptable because none are paid, or is that a violation?
I think that it's okay, but again, you have to look at that criteria of what is a volunteer. If the ED is working full time, then they may not be considered a volunteer. But if they're just working part time, then it's probably okay. Another one of those kind of sticky situations.
Mm-hmm. Now we have one about groups of volunteers. So if you're utilizing volunteers through somewhere like a volunteer center or a business doing a volunteer project, is it necessary to go through all of these steps if they've already been screened by someone like their employer?
So it's the volunteer center that's asking if they need to have them screened, if they've
No,
been.
it would be an organization that's either gone through a volunteer center or through a local business to find a group of volunteers.
I am thinking that the volunteer centers probably haven't screened them.
Mhm.
So you would want to do your own.
Oh, and we have a comment from someone else who said they have gotten pushback from groups that want to volunteer but don't want to go through the full process. So that's really interesting. Something that groups maybe don't understand why all of these steps are necessary.
Yeah, I think you really need to look at your own organization and what you're going to have those volunteers do, because if you have any kind of liability, you have to protect yourself and prevent that, lower that risk.
All right, we've got another one. Are there special considerations for volunteers who are minors? Linda.
Yes, yes, I would say, there are going to be some things that you don't want minors to be doing on their own, things for safety reasons and to protect them, of course. But as far as a classification of employee or a classification as a volunteer, again, I'd just say go back to that criteria. But yeah, there are certainly different things to think about with minors. Although some of the things still apply, you probably want to have a volunteer application and an interview, and they deserve volunteer position descriptions just like any adults would.
And just being mindful too of the, if you're looking to have young people on your board, they need to be, state laws that they need to be 16.
To be voting members.
Thank you.
All right, well, that looks like all the questions that have been submitted thus far. We can give everyone a few more moments if you'd like to put anything into the Q&A box. I will ask Linda and Karen.
And if you want to pose a question for us to talk about at the member mastermind, feel free to do that too. We can discuss it with everyone there and share ideas.
Yes, and you can do that now, or you can do that if you think of it, if you think of questions during the week, shoot us an email, let us know. It's nice to see all the comments in the chat too. Any other questions?
I have not seen any come through. Wonderful job, Karen and Linda. I learned so much. Thank you for putting this together.
And thank you to everyone who participated with us tonight.
Yeah, we hope to see some of you at the member mastermind next week too.
You guys are getting lots of comments in the chat that people learned a lot. Awesome. Thank you all for coming.
Yes, thanks.
Have a good night, everyone.